Welcome to the Sage Advice Podcast, transforming the way people think and work so their organizations can thrive. Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to our podcast. I'm Ed Kless, and with me today is Adam Mendler. Adam is the CEO of the Veloz Group, a serial entrepreneur, writer, and speaker with a national platform on business leadership. Adam is on a mission to create better, more resonant leaders by distilling lessons learned from building 3 successful businesses in 3 different industries and from interviewing hundreds of America's top leaders. Adam has long shared his insights in the pages of Forbes, Inc., and other media outlets, and has been speaking extensively over the past several months about how to lead during a time of crisis and how to thrive in the new work environment. Welcome to the Sage Advice Podcast, Adam Mendler.
Ed, thank you for having me, and I'll tell your listeners what I told you off air. I'm a little bit nervous right now because with the name Sage Advice Podcast, that really set some high expectations. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to live up to it, but I'm going to try my best.
I'm sure you will, Adam. But first question for you is, why do you do what you do?
It's a great question. And the advice that I give to people, no matter what stage in their journey they're in, I actually just gave this advice last night to someone who reached out to me who just graduated from college, but you could be well into your journey. I think it's important to think about 3 different things as you're trying to figure out how to spend your time professionally. Number 1, are you doing something that you really enjoy? Number 2, are you doing something that you're good at? Number 3, are you doing something that is making a difference in the lives of others? And if you can find something that checks all 3 of those boxes, that's it, you found it. And why do I do what I do? Whether it's our office furniture business, Beverly Hills Chairs, whether it's my speaking, whether it's my podcast, 30-Minute Mentors, I try to get involved in different endeavors that I think allow me to check all 3 of those boxes. Do things that I love doing, that I'm passionate about, that I think I'm good at, and where I can make a real difference in as many lives as possible.
And we're recording this on August 5th, the sort of the middle of the COVID-19 crisis, or what we might hope is the middle. We don't really know. And one of the things that you mentioned that you've been doing is doing a lot of time thinking about leading in a time of crisis. So unpack that for me. What are your thoughts on leading in a time of crisis?
There is a lot to unpack, and I hope that we're closer to the end than we are to the beginning. But like you, Ed, I have no way of knowing. We have no way of knowing. All we can really do is stay as positive as possible, stay as productive as possible, control what we can control, and not focus on the negative. My advice for leaders trying to understand how to best lead in a time of crisis. Number 1, it's extremely important to understand that for your team to respond to you, for your team to ultimately react in as an effective way as possible to your leadership, you have to be a leader that's truthful. You have to be a leader that's honest. You have to be a leader that has a word that means something. And that starts way before a crisis starts, and it continues all the way through any crisis that you're in. So you need to lead with honesty. You need to lead with integrity. And that's a core principle of effective leadership. It's something that anytime I've asked one of my guests on 30-Minute Mentors, how important is ethics to leadership on a scale of 1 to 10? The answer is always 10. And anecdote after anecdote explains why in great detail, whether it's a Fortune 500 CEO or a general. That's number 1. Number 2, it's extremely important for leaders to be as communicative as possible. When you think about any crisis that we've been in, and the last major crisis that our economy was in back in 2008, the financial crisis, the investment managers who survived that crisis were not necessarily those who had the best performance during that crisis, but were those who were communicative, were those who didn't hide under the covers, as tempting as it was, were those who didn't dodge their clients' calls when they came in. You have to be in front of whatever is going on. So even though right now it's a little bit harder for us to leverage the traditional tools of communication that we're used to, we need to leverage whatever tools of communication we can, whatever is at our disposal, whether it's doing, Ed, what you and I are doing right now, jumping on a Zoom call, whether it's picking up the phone, text messages. I try to do all the above using Slack, Skype. There are so many different platforms that leaders can leverage to get their message out to individuals and to their teams. And the most important thing is to be as communicative and open as possible. And number three is to really recognize and understand that in times of crisis, as in all times, great leaders are leaders who are prepared for change, understand the inevitability of change, and tool their organizations to respond well to change. Leaders who thrive in moments of crisis are leaders who embrace that mantra. So you need to be flexible, you need to be adaptable. And not only do you need to be flexible and adaptable, but you need to tool your organization so that your organization is one of flexibility and adaptability. So those are a few things that I try to impart upon audiences that are interested in this topic. There's obviously a lot more to unpack, but I think that's a good place to start.
And why do you suppose that, especially as you put it, everyone knows some of these things, that we still see an absence of it in many people in leadership positions?
Well, it's one thing to know the rules of the road, and it's another thing to follow them. I, Ed, you and I both had to learn the rules of the road to get our driver's permit and driver's license, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're followed at all times. I certainly try to follow them, but sometimes it doesn't necessarily happen all the time. So as leaders, we need to remind ourselves of the core principles at all times. And there are a couple things to keep in mind. First and foremost, not everyone who is in a position of authority, not everyone who has a business card that has a role that is synonymous with leader is someone who should be leading. We have elected officials, we have people who are in managerial positions who really shouldn't be leading, but they're there. And just because you're someone with leadership responsibilities doesn't necessarily mean that you're tooled or equipped to be an effective leader. So, what do we do about that? Well, first and foremost, we all need to step up. We all need to play whatever role we can to fill the leadership gap, to fill the leadership void. We need to make sure that there's as much quality leadership provided as can possibly be provided. So don't be deferential in times like these. Step up to the plate and play as best a role as you can.
And Adam, we have an exit question that we ask all of our guests, and that is, who is a hero of yours and why are they a hero?
And that's a really timely question because a hero of mine and someone who I think is a hero of all of ours was the great John Lewis. Is there any greater hero in our country than John Lewis? And when you think about someone who laid it all on the line throughout his life, throughout his youth, throughout every phase of his life, to try to make the world a better place, to try to make the country a more perfect union, to try to uplift others. When you talk about a great leader, someone who truly looked out for the betterment of others, and someone who is willing to sacrifice in ways that most of us can only really read about in the history books. Man, that's someone who I will admire on a level that I can't even describe on this podcast, and hard for me to put into words.
And lastly, Adam, how can somebody contact you?
I try to make it as easy as possible. That's actually a much easier way to put into words, something I could more easily describe. It's just my name, Adam Mendler. So you can find me at adammendler.com. That's my website. On social media, at Adam Mendler. So that's at Adam Mendler on Twitter, at Adam Mendler on Instagram. My podcast, 30-Minute Mentors, where I go one-on-one with the most successful people in the country on how they got to the top and on how listeners can get to the top as well. Each week, a new episode with another highly successful person, CEO, founder, celebrity, athlete, general, admiral. You can find 30-Minute Mentors at 30minutementors.com or on your favorite podcasting app, whatever app you're listening to this great podcast on.
Adam Mendler, CEO of the Veloz Group, thanks so much for being a guest on the Sage Advice podcast.
Ed, thanks so much for having me. This was kind of fun.
For more Sage Advice, visit and subscribe at sageadvicepodcast.com.